Hey, dickheads, like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from all over the internet to your brain hole. We are coming to you from Half-Life today to talk about Ubik through the eyes of an award-winning author, Cynthia Pelayo, who's the author of many books, including Children of Chicago, The Forgotten. I try to pluralize it. It's The Forgotten Sister.
Forgotten Sisters.
Sisters. I should be pluralizing.
But you're right, because it is the Forgotten Sister.
Okay.
Based
But
off
you have a new book, Vanishing Daughters, which we will talk about specifically because you hinted to me before a couple interviews ago on my podcast that it was inspired by Ubik. And so we're going to be chatting about why Ubik was an influence, how Ubik was an influence, and all that stuff. But before we get into that, and I do want to say that if you want a little bit more background on Senya and her literary trajectory and all that, my interview on Forgotten Sister is up there. And also I did one on Vanishing Daughters. So we talked a little bit about the Ubik thing, but I wanted to save most of that talk for tonight. And because we were already planning on this. So coming up on the Dick Hangout. So just so you know, the Danabella, the first interview in this series, is already out on YouTube, and you can share that. And it's really important that we share these and get these out because that's how people learn that they can come and be a part of these and eventually join the conversations and ask these questions. I'm going to start this interview, but anybody has questions, you can jump in and ask them at any time. We're all hanging out. I'm just kind of moderating. Next week is a big one. March 25th, I believe, is next Tuesday. I've been getting the dates wrong a lot. And that's Ray Naylor, the author of Mountain in the Sea, is coming on. And we're going to be talking a lot about PKD's influence on him and his new book, Where the Axe is Buried. And we're going to be talking about Stanislaw Lem and why it's better to read it in Russian because Ray is that cool. He has read most of Lem's books in Russian. That's going to be a neat discussion. And then the week after, Cyberpunk Patient Zero, John Shirley will be joining us. And he's also going to talk about having Harlan Ellison and Ursula Le Guin as a teacher at Clarion, which is pretty freaking cool thing to talk about. After that, now this is one you got to do a little prep for. We're going to have my co-host from this podcast is going to come on as a guest. D. Harlan Wilson, Professor Wilson. Many of you met him at PKD Fest in Colorado last year. He's going to be talking about his book that came out today, Strangelove Country, which means it would help and it would behoove you to go through and watch some of Stanley Kubrick's science fiction films. But a lot of the discussion is how Kubrick's films have influenced the megatext of science fiction film in general. But that means AI, because that was originated as his project. 2001, Doctor Strangelove, and what was the other one? I'm forgetting. I'm brain farting. There's another one. But
2001. You got that?
Which one?
2001.
Yeah, 2001.
And Doctor Strangelove.
Yeah,
Okay.
and AI. We're going to talk a lot about AI. Clockwork Orange. That's right.
There you
Nick.
go. There's the one.
Clockwork Orange. Yes. So watching those movies between now and then probably wouldn't hurt you. But you got a little bit of time because I think that's going to be April 8th. And then one guest I'm working on is Brian Atterbury, who's an expert on Ursula Le Guin. So he wrote a couple books with her. So just have that in the back of your mind that we're going to have a chance to talk to somebody who was who worked closely with Le Guin. So that should be pretty exciting, but we got fun stuff going on. Anyways, Senya, it is really exciting to have you here to talk about this book. Now, I want to really quickly say also that there's a lot of horror writers that are very influenced by this book. But before we get into that, just give us a thumbnail about how you became a writer and what your background in literature is.
Sure. So I started off as a journalist, and I left journalism, and I did marketing research. I was a market research consultant, so I did research and analysis, data analysis for a long time, and I was miserable. And so I wanted to go back to writing. I got an MFA at the School of the Art Institute, and I worked with Jesse Ball, who does a lot of absurdist. At the time, I was doing a lot of absurdist type literature, and I worked with Ruth Margraf, who's a playwright. The reason why, because at that time, they genre wasn't a thing that was being taught at the School of the Art Institute, and so they were like, "We don't know what to do with you." And so I worked with them, and they were like, "Well, you're a dark fiction writer that doesn't know that they're a dark fiction writer." Just yeah, and they recommended that I read all of Beckett's works. They recommended I read all of Borges's works. And they also recommended that I read all of Agatha Christie's works because of her logic. It's very logical, the way she kind of like expands or explains like the crimes or whatnot. And so from there, I did a lot of self-publishing after I finished. I did a lot of indie publishing. And now I'm traditionally published, which takes about 25 years, but to a lot of people, they're like, that's overnight. It's been overnight. Like, it's been 25 years. So I do a lot of genre blending. So I blend elements of horror, mystery, detective, fairy tale. Fairy tales appear in all of my works or fables. And that's a little bit a quick overview.
Yeah, and you're a Chicagoan, like Professor Gill here,
Right.
who grew
Dropped
up in
out of Lincoln Park High School in 1990.
Really? I went to Kelvin Park, if you know where that's at. It's like on the northwest side.
Yeah. Kind of way out there.
Yeah, it was like it was a tough school back then in the 90s. Yeah.
And,
right on. Okay.
And Cynthia's books are very tied to kind of haunted Chicago or a mythology of Chicago, a history of Chicago. And so anyone who's really interested in that city, that these are must-read books. And I've always been interested in Chicago. I grew up in Indiana, so I had a sister that lived in Chicago for 25 years, so I spent a lot of time in Chicago.
Didn't we figure out that we were probably at Punkin' Donuts on a Saturday night at the same?
Yeah, we probably were hanging out at outside hardcore shows at the same time in the late 80s in Chicago. But
Belmont Park.
Yeah, Belmont. Exactly.
I probably saw you.
Yeah. We were probably all hanging out there. Here's the amazing thing about your work is that when you cross these genres, you get all these blends of different styles. And I think what's really neat for me, and one of the reasons why I really was excited to have you on here to talk about this, is I admit I was a little surprised when you said to me like that Philip K. Dick was an influence on a book that you were working on, because at the time Vanishing Daughters hadn't come out and I hadn't read it yet, and it just came out actually last week. So
yeah, it just came out last week.
Yeah, and so I was really excited because we're used to science fiction writers saying that they're hugely influenced by PKD, but it's interesting because you're the third horror writer that I've been told that they were influenced by Ubik. That would be Josh Mallerman, Lisa Morton, and you. So tell me your story is behind discovering Ubik, and we'll go deeper into how it influenced this book.
It was definitely at the School of the Art Institute. That was another writer. My advisors were like, I think you need to be, based off what you're looking at and what you're trying to explore in your writing, we think you need to look at Philip K. Dick. And I was a little apprehensive at the time because I didn't really know much of his works. Like I was like looking at at that time, I'm like looking at Dashiell Hammett and Borges and trying to pull all those meanings and symbolism together. And they're like, no, if you want symbolism and if you want hidden meanings, you also need to look at Philip K. Dick's work. And when I went to Ubik, I was like, wow, like the layers upon layers. And it does And well, I know we'll go into it more, but I like literature that doesn't make any sense, but yet it makes a lot of sense. And it's like a prism that you can keep like turning it and just continually, like infinitely interpret it in multiple ways. And I think that's what is so exciting about his work to me.
Was Ubik the first that you read?
Yes, it
Right.
was you.
And then I think I mentioned to me that also Androids Dream was, yeah.
And then androids. And so it's funny because I just reread Ubik, and then to talk to you all today. I think it's like my third time rereading it, and then I'm gonna go back to androids tomorrow. And I'm like, you know what? To hell with it. I'm just gonna go back and just start going down because I just feel like it triggered something else to rereading it recently. Like it just seems like it's doing a lot, and it's hard because I'm sorry if I'm speaking like all over the place. It's hard because a lot of my work now is commercial work. And you and I have talked about this, where a lot of commercial work tends to be like this paint by numbers. And it's not saying it as an insult to anybody, but it's very formulaic. My work, I like it to be as out of the box and experimental as possible. And I know that's a challenge for my editors. Um, and so I'm constantly trying to find ways, how can I like do this cool stuff and sneak it in to my editors?
Right. And so let's talk about Vanishing Daughters for a bit, because if you're kind of getting into the concept of this, the connection to Ubik is not one that's going to be super obvious when you start like talking about the plot. But when we get more into it, people will see. So, give everybody a little thumbnail about what Vanishing Daughters is about.
And you'll in the initial overview, you will not see any Philip K. Dick. So the initial overview that I snuck into my editor is it deals with Briar Rose Thorne, whose mother has recently died, and she returns to her ancestral home on the south side of Chicago. She is suffering a very intense wave of grief. And she's also overcome with the stress that she's a freelancer who's inherited this crumbling mansion on the south side. And as she is working on freelance articles, she starts piecing together a number of unsolved murders. And she figures out there's a serial killer operating in the city of Chicago. And she's also having these very strange dreams. And she figures out that in order to uh, figure out what's going on with these dreams, she has to stop the serial killer. And the serial killer has essentially figured her out. So if she doesn't stop him, he's going to get her.
Right. And so on the surface, this doesn't immediately recall anything like, no one's going to be like, that's obviously influenced by Philip K. Dick. But some of the ways that you get into the haunting and the situations were inspired by Ubik. So let's talk about that aspect of Ubik that you were really influenced by, because it's really crucial to how the story kind of unfolds.
So when I was grieving my father, and I went through like a really intense grief. It took about a year to kind of wake up from that fog of grief. One of the things that was happening to me personally was like blocks of time were disappearing, or things just kind of felt flipped in my own reality. It was very bizarre, to the point that I had to go see a medical professional, and my family doctor was just like, this is grief. You're just experiencing this really intense form of grief. You're also experiencing night terrors. I was having like hallucinations, auditory, visual. And when I sat down to write Vanishing Daughters, I wanted to play with that idea of time, how time slips, but it was so seamless almost. And I was like, Ubik, that's what's happening there. And not just that, but there were also elements that I wanted to go into further. I wanted it to be a very philosophical text. So my publisher bills it as a thriller. People who are reading it now are like, this is a philosophical, psychological text, because I really go into time. What is time? What is energy? What is the manifestation of energy? What are we? Where's our place in time? And then I also link that discussion to our concept of ghosts. I also discuss, if anyone here is familiar with Itzhak Bentov and a lot of his research on consciousness, what does that mean? Like, where is our consciousness stored? Is our consciousness in our head? Is our consciousness being beamed from somewhere else? So those were some of the things that I tackled in this book. In addition to, I really went intense. I tried to go as intense as I could, but I knew I was going to lose the typical Gen Pop reader on energy and matter. And so one of the things I discussed was Redgate Woods. And Redgate Woods, outside of the city of Chicago, is where the world's first nuclear reactor is buried. They buried this thing. And what was really interesting is after they buried it, a number, like, paranormal activity and sightings spiked in the area. It like went through the roof. And so I wanted to like have a discussion about that. Like, is this device that is meant to shake up energy, did it shake up all this other energy? Like, walking into a dusty house and all these dust motes float around. So there's a lot of that in the book. I know I lost a lot of people, but I didn't lose you. So I figured if I didn't lose you and you got what I was trying to do, I'm like, I'm good. So
Right. Well, and one of the things that's really cool about, because it can operate, this book operates as a, like it's marketed as a thriller, and it operates as a thriller, and it has the serial killer story, and it has like kind of all this information about haunted Chicago and all these things. And that's one of the things that both of your novels that I've read Forgotten Sisters and this one, and both of them have play really well with this like history of Chicago, where you're like, I don't know how much of this is real, and most of it is. And then if you start Googling, you're like, okay, this is all real stuff that Senya is building off of. And so that's cool stuff. But one of the cool things is that there's a whole nother level that this novel is operating on, where you get into, especially like the energy and the consciousness of, and those concepts of ghosts is very similar to Half-Life. So it's funny because Ubik has two influences on this book. The whole kind of time dilation thing about how, one of the greatest things that Ubik does is these clues about how time is off by like the stale cigarettes and these types of things. And so you got that going on, but there's also that whole energy of the dead, that the communication and the Half-Life part and the Bardot of it all in Ubik also plays into like a lot of the ghost elements of the story. And am I wrong about that? Because that's where I really felt a lot of it.
oh no, you're right, because they're like, even early on, like, because so I don't know if this offends people, but I mark up my books. So if you see me doing this to my book, don't be mad. But like, I just kept marking up the book even further with a lot of things that resonated in Vanishing Daughters. Like, when Half-Life is over, she had said, I think you float out of the system out into the stars. And I was like, I swear I probably even have something that's very similar said like that in Vanishing Daughters. And then there's all this talk of like dreaming, and then like the Half-Life state, right? So is Briar, a few people have said, is she even just hallucinating the entire book? Is she in weird sort of like half state of existence? And then with the women that the serial killer in my book murder, it's funny, when I went back and I reread Ubik, I was like, oh, they're in glass coffins that are upright, almost like in the state that they're in Ubik. They're upright and they're like plastic containers. And so it's just funny how you read something so long ago and you see it come back in your work. But there's a lot in here that with the dreams, with consciousness and the various states as well that I just kept circling, and I definitely made it into my own text.
How many years ago did you read Ubik for school? Like,
First time I read it was like in 2008.
okay. Now, do you remember having conversations? Like Gil here has taught Do Androids Dream. How many times have you taught Do Androids Dream, Gil?
100,
Yeah, yeah.
like
So,
literally 100.
yeah, so he's talked a lot with students, but I'm always interested because I didn't read PKD in an academic context. Like, so you had somebody say to you, like, you should read PKD. Do you remember what these conversations in school were like when you were kind of digesting this book? Do you think that played a role in this future influence?
Yes, because I don't think I, considering my writing, I was coming from journalism and then I was trying to write fiction. And I even think today I don't write like a normal novelist. Like I get the, I don't know if it's a criticism or a compliment that her books don't read like a normal book. And I think I would take that as a compliment because I don't want my books to read as a normal novel. I do weave in a lot of nonfiction. So like you mentioned, the history gets woven in, nonfiction gets woven in, and there's still like a story, and there's a lot of symbolism within my text as well. And so I think in reading it in an academic setting, what was shown to me was here is how he took these philosophical ideas and almost Gnostic ideas as well and weave them in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is, one of all the reasons why we're able to spend so much time talking about PKD. The fact that we spend 2 hours together every Tuesday to go through all this stuff is because of the deep levels and symbolism and things that we're still continuing to find, which is just insane.
Well,
Go ahead.
there was this like even like esoteric ideas. Gosh, like they were just jumping out at me even more so. So there was like a part where he said, there's this esoteric as above, so below, as within, so without, that the universe is within you. This concept that your depending on what your belief system is, but there are different beliefs or thoughts that say, well, reality is all perception, right? It's what we are perceiving in this moment, and you get to choose how you want to perceive reality. So if I tell you all, look for something red in your room, you're probably I'm going to go and look for that red thing, and that's sort of that shaping your reality. um, I can go into that a little bit more, but he even and underlined right here is the whole world inside of me, and I circled that. That's that whole concept: as above, so below; as within, so without. And I do know that he had a number of visions. I'm sure you all have spoken extensively about his 8,000 page text. But you could see a lot of those ideas here as well. Not fully explored, but a lot of them already kind of, jumping out.
Well, right. And so we call, or at least I refer to these novels as the personal cosmos novels because he returned to this theme several times. Really starting with Eye in the Sky in the 50s, and then Ubik is in this, Three Stigmata, Maze of Death. He went to this personal cosmos several times. Ubik is generally the one that most people think is the best at doing the personal cosmos thing. Me personally, as a horror guy, Three Stigmata is the one I find most frightening, and the one that I like the most. But it's interesting to me how so many authors who are in the horror realm find Ubik to be this very influential novel. And I know Mallerman has said, for example, the thing for him was, that he loved Ubik because it was about breaking rules, like that. Like he just, as he read it, he was like, "Oh, the rules are all thrown out
Yeah.
here," you know.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no clear cut definition or explanation. Who's dead? When did they die? How did they die? Where are they? How did it end? I love that. I love that it was completely left up to interpretation. You can look at it a number of ways. The time slips, I have heard people say it was confusing. I don't know how it's confusing to them. It all made sense to me, and it could just be the way I read text. But I feel like the way he did the time slips was so seamless that I was so jealous rereading it. Like, oh, I felt like my time slips were a little bit more harsh or jagged. But
Yeah.
that's
Well, PKD liked to do just tiny details that will tell you things are off, you know, and and I think the tiny details is an aspect of it. Now we've talked about this before, being that, and I thought, I'm not sure if I mailed it to you, but the original outline, of course, was for a completely different novel that Phil, and you can see when you read the novel, knowing that he was kind of starting with the psychic spy story, and then the Half-Life thing kind of took over. Um, and it's it was there. The Half-Life stuff was there in the outline, but he kind of just let that stuff go to the forefront. He even refers to it as a secondary theme in the outline. And it's interesting. Do you have any experiences with? I know I'm pretty sure you're a planner. Even just from reading your books, I can tell that you think these out way ahead of time. Um, how much do you let the novel kind of take over, and or does it? Is that a thing that happens with you? Because it does
my last
very
yeah,
much.
my last few novels have been super detail plotted. I've plotted them in Excel, and it wasn't like complete. I wasn't really confined to them. Like if I was writing one day and it went in a different direction, I would just go into my outline and adjust, and then just move from there. I'm working on two novels right now, and that's not working at all. And
Yeah,
so I remember we talked about it, and I realize it's POV. So I'm doing third person close for the first time and since like 2021 in a novel. So right now I'm sort of pantsing two books, which I haven't done in a very long time. But it seems like my novel process or my outline process isn't working right now.
hmm. Well, that's interesting. And what you're talking about is in the last interview we did. We talked about, and maybe we talked about this offline, but right, the last two novels were in first person, and you're
Yeah.
switching that tenses and the point of views,
Yeah.
partially because you felt like that was holding back the novels that you were working on, and and personally, I'm really excited to see what you do with that. Um, and but on that note, Vanishing Daughters. Let me just say this for those either here now or watching in the future on YouTube. Vanishing Daughters is really excellent horror folk, like the folk tale horror crossoverness of it is very Guillermo del Toro in tone, as far as like think of like a Pan's Labyrinth type tone, like dark fairy tale. But what's really cool about it is that these hidden themes and things that are going on in it, and it's just and the serial killer aspect. I don't want to give away the twist, but there's a really good twist. And if there's clues that we've given in the things that we've talked about of what the serial killer's origin, um, and it's really interesting stuff, and I really love the twist. So I hope people will check it out. And but we'll continue this discussion a little bit, and I want to open up the floor if anybody has any questions for Senya about specifically these books or writing. You have I know people might have a lot of questions about your writing process. So any of that stuff, if we just want to open up the floor, does anybody have any questions or
Yeah,
all?
let me go, man. I'm
Yeah,
ready.
go, Gil. Go.
So, uh, these kind of like Half-Life ghost type characters that are sort of insubstantial. Unfortunately, I haven't read your work, but just going from what Eggs is saying, they play a part in your fiction. I'm
Yeah.
wondering, you've kind of alluded already that these ghost characters in some ways allude to mourning. Like
Yes.
like a ghost works in a couple of different ways. A ghost could represent like the energy that we feel mourning this person, the fact that they're still around because they're in our thoughts, whatever. I'm wondering if also you could comment on the ghost as kind of like recapitulating life under late capitalism, where you really can't move the needles of power. Every aspect of your mediation with reality is increasingly, I should say, in every interaction is increasingly mediated.
Mm,
Um, is that something that you're playing with in this or not?
no, but that's really interesting. Um, and
As a literary guy, I think that's why ghosts are really popular now because they resonate with our lack of agency.
yeah, and I think they can be representative. They can be a commentary on so much, and they're become, at least the way I wrote the ghosts, or I've written ghosts in my work, they're almost like manifestations of something. So like
Right.
they can be manifestations of violence, or manifestations of grief, or manifestations of a number of things. And so in looking at I mean, in Forgotten Sisters, the entire, I guess, ultimate thesis of that novel is I was writing. It was a novel about the corporate mishandling that led to 844 immigrant deaths in 1915. And so, what does that mean when a corporation is liable for all of these deaths, but never actually held accountable? And what does that memory of all of those lost people do to communities over time?
I read Ubik about a year ago and we were doing this full 16-week class on Phil Dick online. And the thing that I came away with it is the first bit of biographical information that's important is that at the time he was writing, Ubik was probably his heaviest amphetamine use of his life.
Yeah.
And at that point, it was, I think, had a pretty significant impact on his day-to-day existence. And when I read that book last year, what I came away with was like, man, this is a book about amphetamines and about like how when you're coming down, you're slowing down in time, and when you're coming up, you're going up in time, and how you're like dying to this world because you're so involved in your addiction and so on and so forth. I don't think that's a common interpretation, but again, like that's the great thing about these books is they just resonate with all this different stuff. So I'm not sure that's so much of a question. I just wanted to relay that to you as
Yeah,
somebody who
no,
studied
thank you.
Phil Dick for his whole life. It's a really important thing to bring to Ubik, I think, when you're thinking about that book.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I did see um the usage. I didn't know the time period though. So that's what I was curious. I was really curious to know the influence of him on, on any substances and off. Like do you see a shift in tone in any of his works from?
So if you go back to like an early work like Eye in the Sky,
Yeah.
he's really, really careful. He's
Yeah.
incredibly careful. There's nothing. I mean, it's really beautiful carpentry, cabinetry, craftsmanship. And then as it goes along, he just gets more sort of ragged and disheveled in sort of the editing process and the care with which he's dealing with the plot and the nuances of what's happening. And in a lot of ways that makes it more likable because he's looser, he's freer, he's maybe making more free associative stuff. And he's definitely working more free from the genre. But I mean, I think by the very end, he's kind of even kidding himself about what he's accomplishing because he's high on his own supply, so to speak.
But at the same time, Do Androids Dream is a very careful
That's the last one, though. I mean, that's it. Like,
Yeah.
and I think for some reason that snapped into a very organized form because because he was working with dialectics, because he was working with like the robot destroyer in Deckard and the robot repairer in what's his Isidore and so on and so forth.
Welcome, Blake.
Yeah. Okay, let's ask Nick McCraggan's question, which is who are some of the
hold on before you do that. If you guys have a question, I haven't mentioned this before, but you can go down to reactions and hit raise your hand.
Oh, there you go.
And Nick, did you want to ask your question verbally?
Sure, Eggs. I'll be happy to. Glad to have you here. It's great. It's a great honor to have you and speak to you tonight. So, what are some of the contemporary horror authors that you enjoy? And I'd be interested to know what about their writing or what qualities they have that you appreciate.
I like Gwendolyn Keist's work a lot. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar.
I have read Gwendolyn Keist.
Yeah, I really enjoy Gwendolyn Keist's work. I also read a lot of poetry, and Sarah Tatlinger is an indie author. She's a poet, and I love how she describes as glitter and gore, just the musicality of her words. I feel like I go more for psychological, atmospheric. I like any crime writers that will like blend and shift things. Like I love Lauren Bukas's The Shining Girls. That's like a time traveling serial killer as well. I don't know if you're familiar with that, or Broken Monsters.
I love Broken Monsters because it's set in Detroit too. That's where I live.
Yeah, so I'm happy you're like, yeah. So I was always like, every time I go back, I've read The Shining Girls like once or twice. No, 3 times actually. And every time I go back and reread it, I'm so jealous that I didn't write that book. Like, how could I didn't write a time traveling? I do like Mariana Enriquez quite a bit. Anything atmospheric and anything that will blend Samantha Schweblin, if you know Samantha Schweblin's work. So anything that's psychological, beautiful prose, and anything that will incorporate like the detective. I'm just obsessed with the character of the detective. I incorporate a lot of detective fiction into my work.
Yeah, and there's a detective detective duo that you repeated from the last 2 books.
Yeah.
And they're gonna get their own book someday, I'm sure. Like,
I really want to. We'll see, because I've been wanting to do something that really just kind of reinvents. I've been reading a lot of academic texts on the detective, and so I don't know if I'm ready to tackle that yet, but we'll see.
Right. An author that I think, Nick, is similar to what Cynthia does, is that is really, really good, who started off as a horror writer, is Sarah Pinborough, is from England, is one who I love, who's in that horror contemporary vein, and she's coming back to horror with her next book after doing a lot of these feminist thrillers in that kind of Gone Girl territory. That Netflix series Behind Her Eyes was Sarah Pinborough, by the way. But she's got a haunted house novel as her next novel. And also she has one of the best dogs on the internet. Her dog, Ted.
I do like Amakatsu and The Hunger. That's about like the Donner Party. So if you want somebody that's done history really well, and horror, Amakatsu's The Hunger. I love that one.
And she worked in the CIA and wrote a really great spy novel too called Red Widow.
She made the transition to spy novels. So there you go. Start working on your detective novel.
Yeah. I gotta get my detectives. Yeah. Night Film. Have you read some Night?
Yes, I have read Night Film.
Okay, I love
really. And then what was interesting about Night Film too was, wasn't there like a whole online component to it for a while? Yeah.
That's another, what she did with Night Film. I thought that was super cool. Gemma Files did something similar with where is it?
Experimental film.
That's a good one. That's a great one too. If you like something, if you want something in that vein, experimental film is good.
Yeah. And just so you know, in the future, Nick, I know just as much about horror as I do PKD, so you can always come back to me on that.
If we ever get together, we'll sit down and jam about that for a while too.
Yeah, because that's how I know Senya is. We hung out at StokerCon this year. So.
Yeah, so I don't read much, but I'm not like the body horror person. I don't know what it is. Like I enjoy watching, like I love like the French extremism films. Like I love Martyrs. I loved Inside, which I love is probably like a strange word to use, but I did enjoy watching those films. But when it comes to like reading body horror, I can't read it. It just there's something about it. Like I need to see it on the screen, and then but otherwise reading, I need to feel the anxiety. That's what I really enjoy. I like to just feel like there's something happening and I don't know what. And I really like texts that just make me so completely confused and I have no idea what's going on. I love that. And I call it what I try to do is like my Alice in Wonderland type effect. Like I want to write something that you have no idea what's going on and then everything comes together at the end. And so any writers that can do that, that's what I like reading.
Mm-hmm. Well, we talked about that too because my feeling is, and there's a quote from, and I think it's great writing advice. The director of Silence of the Lambs once said, "You can confuse me for 15 minutes, but don't bore me for 15 seconds." Yeah. And I thought I always keep that in the back of my head is I don't mind if a book doesn't explain everything to me right away and I can be confused, but just keep me interested. And if you give me the information eventually, I'll be really excited. I just finished reading Maurice Broaddus's Astra Black, the second book in the Astra Black trilogy. And the thing about those books is there's so much information because Maurice puts so much hilarious stuff into it. And a lot of it, you just can't process all of it right away. And then sometimes it'll be like 50 pages later, I'll be like, oh, that's the sister. Okay, I get it now. Like, and I'm fine with that. And I always keep that writing advice in my head of the Jonathan Demme is the name of the director of Silence of the Lambs. Said that.
Yeah, I definitely like that.
Big Chicago guy, Jonathan Demme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, you have a question?
Hi. I enjoyed listening to the interview. I should say maybe I'm based in Scotland. I enjoyed.
And it's the middle of the frickin' night for Dan.
Hey, thanks for joining.
A pleasure to speak with you. And I've enjoyed starting to read the book. I read some chapter 1, well, the prologue, and then chapter 1. And from chapter 1, I got like this really strong impression of just the power setting, especially in connection with memory and death. And I think all of that, like I believe I remember from Ubik, with the, as you said earlier, the coffins and the connection of memory and death to setting. And yeah, with your first chapter, it was like, well, it just seems like you make the setting seem like it's an actual character, like it comes alive. I felt like it's really, really strong, right? I wondered if there's anything like any connection like that. I also wondered, like, if like what the word count was.
The word count for
Forgotten Sisters.
Oh, or Vanishing Daughters, the newest book.
Yeah.
The news. I usually do about 90,000 words. My novels. In terms of the houses in both of them, I didn't want to do like a scary haunted house. I thought that was just done to death. And I wanted to do a haunted house that was more like an entity that was an extension of the family that was trying to communicate with the family. So like in Vanishing Daughters, she's mourning and the house is mourning as well. And I feel like, I don't know, I personally feel that there's just something if you've ever walked into a room after and two people had just been arguing, you can feel that energy. You feel something, you walked into something. And so I wanted to kind of create that effect with a house. If somebody is mourning a loved one that died in this house, how would the house react? How would the house tell the person, uh, warn the person about certain things? And so it's kind of like a moody house, but I didn't want it to feel scary, even though there's a few scary things that did happen to her. I think ultimately the house loves her, but it's just trying to shake her to realize that she needs to get off her ass and do something.
And the vibe is, especially Forgotten Sisters, the vibe in the house is extremely strong. And one of the things I like about that is it's, the house in Vanishing Daughters is more of like a big mansion, and but it feels like a more kind of everyday house in Forgotten Sisters, and that's kind of one of the things I like about it.
Yeah,
and,
it's definitely everyday house. It's more of a working class house. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we got about 10 minutes left, and then Senya, you're more than welcome to stay for the second hour, but I want to give you freedom because I know it's still Chicago there. But I really appreciate this chance, but you also had the chance to ask a bunch of Philip K. Dick nerds questions too. And I'm wondering, because you said you wanted to continue this journey, reading more PKD. Have you thought about where you're going next, or like what's your plan there, or do you want advice from these dickheads?
Well, if you were going to do something that was going to flip the detective narrative on its head, which PKD book would you look at for inspiration?
All right, Blake
Scanner.
has a thought. Scanner.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah, Scanner Darkly for sure.
Bob Arctor is a cop, detective, and then kind of experiences the ultimate in the product of the commiserotomy and the splitting of the corpus callosum, and splits into two different people and ends up observing himself, narking on himself. So
that's one.
So whether that's detective in the sense that he's solving a crime, so he's a detective. Or
what about Flow My Tears? That's another detective one. Yeah,
for sure. And it's a police chief. It's not just a kind of rank and file, but it's a high-ranking police officer who has split in two with his twin sister. So, the themes
time-binding drug, right? So there's your time element again.
Yeah, and I forget what it's called in Flow My Tears.
Yeah, I think definitely Scanner Darkly and Flow My Tears, the policeman said. Now, that being said, I think everyone who's interested in the horrific need to read Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge, because to me, that's first of all, I think that's PKD's masterpiece. It's also his weirdest book. But you always have to give people the caveat when you're telling people to read Three Stigmata, is that it took me 3 times reading it to fully feel like I grasped everything that was going on. And so that one's like kind of the deep end of the pool. But again, and also for me, I think one that I think is underrated is Galactic Pot Healer, because I think it's the one that best shows Phil's world building and use of humor. I think
he goes to a world that he never describes in any physical detail.
But he does it. Yes. But I think it's really interesting.
That's definitely a built world, but there's not because there's any detail about what it looks like.
That's true. And I will tell you guys.
Is there a cop in it?
And we'll talk more about this in the second hour, but I started working on my article, The Waking Nightmares of Philip K. Dick, where I'm talking about Philip K. Dick and horror. And to me, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is super underrated for how cosmic horror it is, on many levels. But there's an entire paragraph, and I know I quoted this on Facebook last week, but there's an entire paragraph about how the dust has won. and has just, you know, and that whole paragraph is one of the most cosmic horror things I've ever read, more than Lovecraft. That whole thing about the dust winning, and it's a paragraph that almost no one notices in PKD. But by the way, and on that, I do want to shout out the Australian academic Ellen Greenham wrote this book After Engulfment that's about cosmic horror in Lovecraft, PKD, Robert Heinlein, and Frank Herbert. And this is super academic stuff, but she has a whole like 4 pages devoted to that paragraph on the dust.
I love that.
It's awesome. Really geeky stuff. But, you know, that's, I don't know.
Actually, since we have 5 minutes, I want to ask, and it's going to be different because I just love hearing this. How do you interpret the ending?
Of what?
Ubik.
Yeah.
Start with Gil.
Cheap twist at the end that never really intended to make any sense. No greater meaning in it. Just pure absurdity.
And what you should know, Senya, about the ending is that Phil's good friend, who's a friend of ours, Bill Cyril, who's been part of these hangouts before, gave him shit about it.
Yep.
And
really?
and
Yep.
Phil said it was cheap.
Yep.
And yeah, and admitted that it was, yeah, because I think Bill said that he told him, he was like, I think that it's a great book, but that was a shitty ending.
Mm-hmm.
And Phil
it was a cheap trick of an ending, and Phil agreed. Yeah.
And Phil agreed and laughed about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Wow.
But he also thought that book was like the most divinely inspired of anything he ever wrote, and he talked about it in the exegesis more than any other book at all. I mean, he goes on and on and on about how amazing it is and how important it is and how it was the beginning of really his revelations of divine knowledge and all that stuff.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about it too. But and one thing about Ubik for me is that one of the reasons why Ubik doesn't hit me as hard as it does a lot of other people is that I didn't read Ubik until we read it for the podcast. And so I read it in publication order, and I had already seen him do Personal Cosmos books, I think, better than Eye in the Sky and Three Stigmata. And so to me, Ubik was not as impressive as it was to the people who read it as their first time seeing Phil do this stuff with the Personal Cosmos thing. And so for that matter, it just didn't knock my socks off the way it did a lot of other people.
Oh, we should mention, make sure Senya knows about Bobak. Do you know about Bobak, Senya, which is a short story by Fyodor Dostoevsky that appeared in 1873? I'm just reading from the Wikipedia here. The story consists largely of a dialogue between recently deceased occupants of graves in a cemetery, most of whom are fully conscious and retain all their features of their living personalities. The dialogue is overheard by a troubled writer who has lain down near the graves. The title Bobak refers to the nonsensical utterance repeatedly made by one of the cemetery's residents, an almost completely decomposed corpse who is otherwise silent. The writer also reports a kind of auditory hallucination of the word prior to his hearing of the dialogue. Blah 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 blah. So it's been posited that Dick is working off of this Dostoevsky novel, although he never told anybody that he was.
Interesting.
Sounds like Counterclock World.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go take a look at that. Thank you.
Well, and also in the outline, one thing that's very funny is that in the outline for Ubik, he mentions that when he's talking about the people making calls in Half-Life to their Half-Life, that it's very busy around the holidays, and he talks about how the fact that you have to use an operator. And so it's showing, like, being from the 60s, that you would have to like call up an operator and say, like, I need to call this dead person, right, like put me through. And so there's some really interesting and fun moments with that. All right. Now, Senya, like I said, you're more than welcome to hang around, and we get really nerdy here, like talking about esoteric, or just like sometimes we've been arguing about like where Dick was on a particular night of the the year 1953 or whatever. So it gets pretty nerdy. But let's close off this interview for the folks at home. Where can people find your work? And what's the best social media handles to follow you?
Find me at my website, cynthiapelayo.com. Social media, I'm at Cynthia Pelayo at Blue Sky, or Cynthia Pelayo author, and then Cynthia Pelayo author on Instagram. But I'm trying to update my website as much as possible.
Right.
Can I ask real quick what's the most haunted place in Chicago?
Oh, good question.
So I've never experienced anything super strange. A lot of people would say in the city of Chicago, a lot of people would say maybe the St. Valentine's Day massacre site. I think the Riverwalk where the SS Eastland capsized has had some strange things. One of the most purportedly haunted places in the Chicagoland area, the greater Chicagoland area, is a decommissioned cemetery called Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. The last burial there was in like the 1960s, 1970s. And like the road is even decommissioned and you have to like hike up there. It's actually just a very sad little patch of land because in the 70s, a lot of kids would go there and like kick over the gravestones and dig up the bodies and do not cool things. So people have said Bachelor's Grove, and supposedly Al Capone would like, and his people, because it wasn't him, would dump bodies at this like murky pond that's on that land.
I live near Belmont and Ashland and Lincoln Avenue, that six corners there. And there was a whole host of crazy people. There's a whole host of eccentric people who were convinced that area, because of the way that the streets all aligned, was a place where there was information being transferred. And so they would there was like 3 or 4 of them, and they would lay out these laser discs on the ground in these very interesting ways, and they would do sort of like, they put aluminum foil on themselves and move around that whole area. It was always the scene.
I haven't heard that. Belmont, Ashland, and where?
And Lincoln. So it's the 6 corners. Yeah, right there. This was 30 years ago. The whole neighborhood has changed, but it used to be kind of a great, like, kind of, there wasn't that much stuff around there, and there was a lot of just like really, like I said, very eccentric people, often in very disheveled mental states. But they seemed to be keyed in around this transmission at that site with these laser discs as the receiving operating device.
Laser discs.
Yes. I mean, I think that's something you could kind of like find in the, you find a bunch of those in the dumpster and you go, oh my God, see, the aliens want to communicate.
Well, on that note, Sonia, it was awesome having you here.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate your time. Back in the studio, Larry, we're almost done. So, oh wait, Blake, you have a question? You have your hand up. Do you want this? Is this for Senya?
That's applause, David.
Thank you.
Applause. Okay. Well, yes. So, Larry, back in the studio, as always, we always end the Dickheads podcast the same way. Keep it paranoid, folks.